And so now it is my absolute pleasure to bring us together for the lecture today by introducing the exhibition that we're going to be discussing in a little bit of greater detail. Mountains of the Mind, Scholars Rock from China and Beyond is a really beautiful and wonderful exhibition that we have here at the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. This exhibition opened in August of 2023, and it's on view for nearly a year. It remains on view until June 23rd of this coming year, so we still have plenty of time to see it. Mountains of the Mind was curated by our Curator of Asian Art, Dr. Rhiannon Paget, who is here on the call with us today. And it's made possible through the generosity and passion of Stan and Nancy Kaplan, who I wanted to thank for their very generous donation of Scholars Rocks. Their interest in Scholars Rocks is truly contagious. I know I have caught the bug, and I'm really excited for all of us to explore that area a little bit more in detail today. So huge thank you to Stan and Nancy Kaplan, as well as Dr. Rhiannon Paget for curating the exhibition. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert D. Mowry. I have a short bio that I will be reading, and then I'll turn it over to him without any further ado. Dr. Robert D. Mowry was for many years the Alan J. Dworsky Curator of Chinese Art and the head of the Department of Asian Art at the Harvard Art Museums. He was also the senior lecturer in Chinese and Korean art at Harvard's Department of the History of Art and Architecture. He is a specialist in Chinese art who has done considerable work with Korean art, publishing in the field and building a collection of Korean paintings and ceramics for the Harvard Art Museums. With triple undergraduate majors in French, European art history, and medieval humanities, he originally planned to study late medieval architecture and manuscript painting in graduate school. But his 2 years in Korea in the Peace Corps in the late 1960s sparked an abiding interest in Asian art and culture. He did his graduate work at the University of Kansas, studying with Chu-Tse Lee and Lawrence Stickman, and specializing in Chinese art. As part of his graduate work, he spent 2 years as a curatorial assistant and translator at the National Palace Museum, Taipei, from 1975 to 1977. He spent most of his career at the Harvard Art Museums, beginning there as an assistant curator in 1977. Taking a break from Harvard, he served as the founding curator of the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Third Collection at the Asia Society in New York from 1980 to 1986. On his return to Harvard in 1986, he was appointed Curator of Chinese Art and then named the first Alan J. Dworsky Curator of Chinese Art in 2000. His best-known publication, Hare's Fur, Tortoiseshell, and Partridge Feathers, Chinese Brown and Black Glazed Ceramics, 400 to 1400, is the catalog of a 1995 exhibition that pioneered the scholarly study of Chinese brown and black glazed ceramics. Important to today's talk, his 1997 Worlds Within Worlds, the Richard Rosenblum collection of Chinese Scholars Rocks, remains the standard reference on Scholars Rocks today. On his retirement in 2013, Harvard formally named Dr. Robert D. Mowry Curator Emeritus. Since his retirement from Harvard, he has served as a senior consultant in Chinese and Korean art at Christie's. Though he's working primarily with the Christie's New York offices, he also has responsibilities towards the London, Paris, and Hong Kong offices. So as you can imagine, Dr. Mowry is a very busy man, and we are very fortunate and very grateful for him giving his time to us today. So without any further ado, Dr. Mowry, please take it away.
Thank you, Katie. And before we go on, just let me know if the microphone is picking up my voice at an appropriate level. It's okay. Good. I'm glad to know that. Well, thank you, Katie, and good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, if only virtually, but I'm delighted by your interest in the exhibition and in Chinese Scholars Rocks, and I am so pleased that you have joined us. Now, like any good art historian, I brought far more slides than I should, so let's jump right in. Now, when we talk about Chinese stones or collected rocks, first we have to say that there are two types. They're related, but they're actually very different categories. The first category are garden rocks, as you see here. As the name implies, They are intended to be seen outdoors in the garden. They are large and typically set on a base of stone or planted directly in the ground. The other type of collected rock are scholars' rocks, represented in the exhibition at the Ringling, and as you see in this slide. They are much smaller. They are more visually refined, and instead of just sitting on a table, they are displayed on a wooden stand, as you see in this example. Now, looking at each tradition in a little bit of detail, the garden rocks, as I mentioned, are large. This one, for example, is about 10 feet tall. This is in the Yuyuan Garden in Shanghai. We don't know its history for sure, but tradition and legend hold that this rock was collected in the beginning of the 12th century, that it was supposed to have been sent to the northern Song capital, which then was in Kaifeng, and that it was for the Emperor Huizong. You see, this interest in rocks dates back more than 1,000 years, and this was to have gone, supposedly, to Kaifeng to be displayed in the imperial palace. Legend further asserts that, and it was going to travel by ship in the Grand Canal, that the ship sank and the rock was recovered from the Grand Canal, and that it has been in Shanghai ever since. Now, how much of that's true, how much of it's just legend, we don't know, but it is a splendid garden rock. It's a Taihu stone, and you see all of the perforations, which don't mean anything significant. They're just there adding visual interest and excitement. You can imagine how much less exciting it would be if it were just a solid stone of this size. But the perforations add interest to it. Now, these types of gardens in which the garden rocks were displayed, we don't know how they might have been displayed in the Northern Song period when that rock was intended to have been sent to the Emperor Huizong in the early 12th century. But the classic Chinese gardens that still exist today came about in the Ming Dynasty and are in Suzhou, Shanghai, that particular area. In those gardens, when they were first established, and this is a painting from the Ming period, from the mid-16th century, you see that the garden rocks tended to be displayed alone. A single beautiful rock set against the whitewashed wall of the building, or, as in the previous, looking at the rock in Shanghai, against a whitewashed wall. There you see it in the painting. Here I've taken the caption away and you get a better view. Just a single rock in this particular painting, giving some idea of what gardens looked at that time. Now, this painting is from the 18th century, and still we see it's a thatched roofed pavilion or studio, and you have a group of scholars enjoying themselves, probably on a summer afternoon, looking at antiquities, looking at paintings, doing calligraphy and such. And of course, there is a rock in the scene indicating that it's an elevated, cultivated group of people that have assembled, and that it's a group of scholars. But once again, in the 18th century, you don't see a lot of rocks. You see one particular rock. Here you can see the painting a little better. But when you go to the gardens today, this is the Yuyuan Garden in Shanghai, where that magnificent garden rock is displayed. And if you go to the gardens in Suzhou as well, you will see that many of the gardens are sort of overwhelmed by many rocks, as we see here. So this represents the evolution of the classic garden type over the centuries. Each successive owner, and remember, these gardens have a continuous history going back to the 15th and 16th centuries. Each successive owner has wanted to put his mark on the garden. And they did it not so much by moving the rocks around, but simply adding more and more and more rocks. So that some of the gardens really do look like this today. But keep in mind, it's not the way they originally looked when they were first designed. Now, garden rocks, like the first one, in Shanghai, sometimes are set directly in the ground, but often a garden rock will be set into a marble basin, or at least have a marble enclosure around it when it's in the garden. And this rock is actually in the old Imperial Summer Palace near Beijing. And you see it has the marble enclosure around the base of the rock. Keeps people from getting too close, but it also marks the rock as special, a very special piece to be viewed and admired. Sometimes in a garden, there may be a very small rock that they display, like the one here. In which case, rather than, if it's very special, rather than just placing it on the ground or on top of another rock, so to speak, it will be placed on a pedestal or a base. And the bases for those kinds of garden rocks are usually of marble, as you see here. In the same way that the enclosure around the previous rock was marble, so is this one. Here is a painting of a rock, and most of the paintings that we see of rocks are of garden rocks rather than scholars' rocks. Again, they're allied, closely related traditions, but they are separate traditions at the same time. So here's a magnificent garden rock, not too big, but immediately when you see it, you know it's a garden rock because it's on a stone base, a white marble base here. Now, turning from the garden rocks to the scholars' rocks. Now, first of all, they are collected stones that are meant to be presented indoors, not throughout the house, but in the scholar's studio. And that's why they're referred to as scholars' rocks. Today in Chinese, they're generally known as gongshi. Again, just a name for scholars' rocks. They are much smaller than the garden rocks in general. And they are featured on a wooden base, as you see here, rather than just set directly on a table or a bookshelf. Now, when we want to see them in paintings, this is a scroll in the Cleveland Museum of Art from the 15th century. I'm going to show you a detail. Here you will see looking into the studio, it's a group of scholars again. Here they're actually painting or writing calligraphy while others are viewing antiquities. But when you look in the sort of upper center, you see a scholar's rock on a wooden stand on a table right there. So even though scholars' rocks seldom appear in paintings, in fact, they do occur from time to time, and you see how they are presented. Or here is a painting from 1962 by the famous painter Fu Baoshi. It represents a Ming painter. Of course, it's an imagined scene since it's painted centuries after that artist passed away, but shows him in his studio. And what do we see in the background near the window? But a scholar's rock. And when it's this kind of rock, rather than one with a flat base, and when you put them side by side, it's not this actual rock, but you see it's this kind of rock with a very narrow waist and set on a wooden stand. Now, when we talk about the colors, the garden rocks are mostly taihu stones, and the taihu stones are basically gray. They may be sort of off-white when they're presented, as we'll see, as a scholar's rock. But when they're outdoors with the sun, the wind, the rain and such, they are mostly gray, as you see here. Occasionally, you will see a very fine, small Ling-B rock, and we'll talk more about these different types of rocks later in the lecture. But a Ling-B rock will probably be either black or dark charcoal gray. But the majority of the garden rocks are gray, as you see here. When we look at the scholars' rocks, the most preferred scholar rocks are black. They are Ling-B stones, meaning that they come from Ling-B, one very specific site in northeastern Anhui province. And they have relatively smooth surfaces. Of course, there are some texture to them, but compared to some other types of stone, they're relatively smooth. Now, they may be black, or in this case, the gray, and this is a different type of rock. It's a ying stone. Ying, like Ling-B, indicates the origin of this type of stone. We'll talk about these types of stone later on in the lecture, but here I just wanted to show different colors that you can have with the scholar's rocks. The black and the gray are the most preferred colors, or there may be a mixture, as we have here, shading from black to a rich caramel brown, or you may have a rock that's completely caramel brown or yellow. These colored stones became popular only later, that is to say, in the 18th and 19th centuries. And when I say later, remember that the tradition of the rocks, collected scholars' rocks, dates back to the Song period, back to the 11th, 12th centuries. So terming 18th and 19th century later is just putting it in that particular context. Then there are stocks like this one, two different views, front and back, which is in the exhibition, which has a rust red color, or the brick red that we see here. And again, later in the tradition, probably 19th century, we have even more colors added to the canon, such as the green hornblende stone there, or malachite, as we see here, which became popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, added azurite. But even once those colors were added to the canon, if you will, the black and the gray were always the most prized among the stones. Now, talking about stands, as I said, the scholar's rock is always shown on a wooden stand. Now, in most cases, there are three different types of stands, as we will see. This type is referred to as the northern style, and it was originally associated with Beijing, which by the Ming Dynasty was the capital of China. And it doesn't mean that all of these stands come from Beijing or even from the north, but it's just referred to as the northern style because that's where it originated. And it's like a small table. So basically a flat surface, a little indentation to spark interest on the sides, and then short legs. Now the rock may simply sit on top of this type of northern stand, or as you see here, if the underside of the rock is somewhat uneven, rather than manipulating the rock in any way to make it smooth and flat, the stand will be modified to accommodate any protrusions on the bottom of the rock. So that's the actual stand on which this rock sits. And you can see it really is the same stand. Now that's another northern style stand, and you see the flat top and the lightly articulated sides and short legs. Now I think, look at these quickly. This is in the exhibition. You recognize this northern style stand quite quickly. The next type of stand is the one that you see here. And this is like the one that we saw in the Foubacher painting of the rock sitting in the windowsill. This type has a base, then it will usually have a slender waist, and then there is a receptacle to receive the stone, as you see here. The top of the base often has little articulation in the forms of little bumps. We don't know exactly what they're supposed to mean. Any meaning they might have had has been lost to the mists of time. The base for this type tends to be large and solid, so that it can easily handle the weight of the rock above. Now, this type of stand originated in Suzhou. You'll recall that the gardens, the great classical gardens, were in Suzhou. And so there was great interest in rocks there, both the garden rocks and the scholars' rocks. And there were many scholars' studios, many scholars' gardens and such there. So again, many of these rocks probably were, many of these stands probably were not made in Suzhou, but that's where this type of stand originated. And so it's referred to as a Suzhou type of stand. This rock, again, front and back views, is in the exhibition, and that's the type of stand that you see there. Occasionally, this type of stand will have long legs, as you see here, but the upper portion is still the same, sort of an articulated, bumpy surface at the top, and then a well rises up with a depression to receive the base of the rock. Now, in some cases, instead of having little bumps across the surface, it'll be carved as you see here. It might be that this is just abstract articulation. They might be clouds, or given that this rock is in the form of a bridge, perhaps it's meant to represent rippling waves or a brook moving underneath the rock. In other cases, there will simply be abstract non-representational decoration, as you see there. Now, the Lingbi and Ying stones, as we'll discuss a little later, came from caves and had basically been shaped by water in the caves, eroding the surface of the rock. So the reason for a stand like this, you see the upper part, there are many projecting elements pointing downward from the rock itself. And then in the stand, there are elements pointing upward. When I say they came from caves, sometimes they were taken from the walls, but other times they were like stalactites or stalagmites in the cave, the stalactites hanging down. And so this kind of stand sort of, it's the stand echoing the general appearance of the rock in reverse, and suggests the stalactites, stalagmites in the cave where the rock probably originated. Those were all Suzhou style. This is the third style, which is the southern style, and originated in sort of Guangdong province around Canton, not too far from Hong Kong. And this type of stand, also of wood, tends to be pictorial. So here, when you look at the stand itself, you see that it is carved basically in the shape of rolling waves, some clouds up above. But those southern style stands sometimes will have be carved with flowers or branches. In this particular case, it's waves. Now, often when we think about it, just off the top of our heads, it's easy to assume that stands are something that came about, say, in the 19th century, like things associated, paraphernalia associated with the Victorian age in England. But no, the stands go back 1,000 years. It seems that stands first appeared not just for rocks, but for antiquities, collected antiquities, probably in the Song dynasty, around the 11th or 12th century. It was in the Northern Song period, 10th, 11th, 12th century, when the Chinese first began collecting antiquities. Now, don't be mistaken, they collected things before that, but the interest before the Song dynasty was in collecting ancient paintings and works of calligraphy. But it was in the Song dynasty that they began to collect ancient bronzes, ancient jades, and such. And so now, moving on to the next slide, it's a detail of what you're seeing in the upper right corner here. This painting, again, you can see that it's there. This painting from the late 15th, early 16th century from the Ming dynasty. You can see that the bronze vessel right in the center of this image sits on a wooden stand. By contrast, the little ceramic bottle, which is not holding flowers, it's holding the tools used for manipulating incense, is not on a stand, which indicates that it was a relatively new ceramic piece rather than a collected ancient ceramic piece. So the stand is distinguishing, in this case, old from new, collected antiquity from modern product, if you will. It means that the piece on the stand is worthy of admiration and respect. Now, this also signals us that the rocks being on a stand, the stand is not only there to orient the piece. Without a stand, it might be just a charmless lump, but on the stand, it will appear like a soaring mountain, as we have seen. So the stand is there with the rock not only to give it proper orientation, but to put it in the same general respected realm as collected antiquities. Now, one did not simply go out and find rocks. No, if you were a proper Chinese scholar, you bought the rock at an antique gallery, the same place that you might have bought your bronzes, jades, or your paintings. And of course, it was always with the hope that the rock was an old rock, not a newly found one that was prepared for the market with a stand, but that it was an older rock and that had a history of ownership, a nice pedigree behind it. The same thing that one would want for one's other antiquities and for one's paintings. Now, when we look at this is a section of a hand scroll in the Metropolitan Museum. And here we see scholars gathered once again on a summer afternoon to look at paintings and to enjoy themselves. And when you look at the table at the left, and here's a detail of it, you see in the middle of the table, there is a small rock in the form of a mountain that is being used as a brush rest. so that they could alternate between different brushes while they were painting or writing calligraphy. Now, most scholars' rocks didn't have a functional purpose. They're for aesthetic enjoyment. They are works of art, but occasionally a small mountain-shaped rock might be pressed into service as a brush rest. There, but when you look at the front on the table, you see that there is a pot that is on a stand. Since it's reddish, it might be a lacquer stand as opposed to a wooden stand, but nonetheless, it's obviously an antique vessel, and it's placed on a stand. And when you look at the back end of the table, you see that there is a table screen. And what's there is not a painting, the mountains that are shown in the screen. It's a piece of marble set into a wooden stand, as you see here. Particular type of marble from Dali in Yunnan province. And stones like this were collected not as scholars' rocks, but they were collected for the pictorial quality that they embody, as you see here. And then a fine wooden stand would be prepared to display the rock, or it could have a frame and be put on hung on a wall. And so here you see the similarity between the table screen with the marble landscape, if you will, on the left, and the actual screen there on the table on the right. Now, what do these rocks mean? Well, of course, they refer to mountains, many of them. And why do they refer to mountains? Well, keep in mind the landscape is the principal, the most important subject matter of Chinese painting. Of course, they painted human figures, they painted birds and flowers, they painted other things as well. But in the same way that the human figure is the principal subject of Western art, so is the landscape the principal subject of Chinese painting. Why is this? Well, it stretches back and has to do with philosophy, religion, and things like that. In the West, you think about the Greek tradition of man as the measure of all things. You look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, and you have man created in the image of God. It's only natural that artists and their patrons wanted sculptures and paintings of human figures. Now, in China, it was a very different situation. The landscape and representations of landscape are very much connected with Taoism. And the essential goal of Taoism as a philosophy is to discern those principles which underlie the unity of the cosmos. The idea being that if you can discern those principles, one could live in harmony with them and have a happy, well-ordered life. And so in thinking about what best embodies the harmony of the cosmos, they turn to the landscape, particularly a landscape like this, that is very well organized, very stable. A traditional Chinese landscape of this type, this is known as the monumental Song landscape style, will have a central vertical mountain, which Chinese connoisseurs refer to as the host mountain, and then it will be flanked and buttressed on either side by smaller mountains that the Chinese refer to as guest peaks. And so when you look at many Chinese scholars' rocks, you realize they sort of fall into this mode. And given that the landscape is the principal subject matter of Chinese painting, the scholars' rocks, or garden rocks too, sort of become a sculptural representation of a landscape, if in miniature. Now, this one, when we begin comparing with paintings, when we look at this painting from the late 17th century, which we think is probably the date of that particular rock, you see that the rock is almost a mirror image of the painting. Now, the person who collected the rock probably didn't know this particular painting, but at the same time, images like this of mountains, painted mountains, were in the collector's mind. And so you have this relationship. And so Or you look at something like this. We talk about the Fenghu Isle of the Immortals, which isn't an actual island, but it's an imagined Isle of the Immortals, which rises in the East Sea, sort of opposite Shanghai, Hangzhou, that kind of thing. And so we see paintings, this one again from the late 17th century, when the Isle of the Immortals is depicted. It's usually small at the bottom, small at the top, but kind of ballooning out in the center. It's usually depicted in blue and green colors, sometimes muted, as we see here, sometimes very strong coloration. And because it's an island, of course, it's shown rising out of the waves. Put them side by side, and what do we have here? And that's why this one is called the Fenghu Isle of the Immortals, because of the shape. And then, of course, it was given a stand that represents rolling waves. Or you look at this. The stand is different because it's a very modern stand. But at the same time, when you look at the shape, it has the ballooning shape, the small top, the small bottom. And then, of course, it's blue and green. And so this is where some of these maybe a generic mountain. On the other time, it may refer to the mountain of the Immortals, as you see there. And then there are others that don't refer to a particular painting. This is a forested mountain, for example. Now, this is by the 19th century, there are many writings on scholars' rocks and garden rocks. And a famous connoisseur, Liang Zhoutu, stated, in collecting, it is the choice of rocks that comes first. If the rock does not seem like a painting by the powers of nature, then you shouldn't choose it. And so here we have in texts the emphasis on the visual relationship, and probably the spiritual relationships as well, between collected rocks and landscapes and mountains. But when it comes down to it, when Chinese scholars would look at their rocks, it wasn't looking at the rock and every single time imagining a mountain. Of course, sometimes they did, sitting at the desk, hard at work, thinking, gee, I wish I were in a mountain landscape, and this rock helps to transport me there. But other times, it's simply an appreciation of the formal elements, the same kind of thing that we have in a modern abstract sculpture. This probably, since it's Henry Moore, it may just be abstract forms, it may relate to an abstracted human form. The emphasis is not to figure out how did the person contort him or herself in that way. It's a matter of looking at it and appreciating the shapes, appreciating the relationship between the two parts. With the scholar's rocks, we have it in painting as well. Something like a Jackson Pollock. We don't insist on meaning there. We don't look for a descriptive meaning. It's a matter of a harmonious relationship, a harmonious combination of the lines, the colors, and the way they're all put together. The same thing with the scholar's rocks. It's an enjoyment, an aesthetic appreciation. And what we have to remember is that the Chinese had a much earlier appreciation of the abstract than we did in the West, which really only came about beginning in the late 19th century. Whereas there was an appreciation of the abstract in painting, in sculptures of rocks and things like that, much, much earlier. Now, in judging a rock, and of course, these are general criteria, they apply to some rocks and not to others, but these are the four qualities that are listed in the classical text. Show, which means thin or slender, and certainly applies to some rocks. Toe, which means transparent or penetrable, and this refers to the small hollows in the rocks, not the holes that go all the way through, but the little hollows and dimples, if you will, that we will see on some other rocks. Low actually refers to the holes or apertures that penetrate the rocks, and you can see through. And then Joe refers to, it actually means wrinkles, and it refers to the surface textures. So these are the qualities, but it's for each connoisseur to interpret how they apply, what they mean in relation to a particular rock. But just know that there is a particular set of criteria by which rocks are judged. And these are the four. Of course, there are more things too, and each century adds more qualities and characteristics, but these are the basic characteristics, aesthetic characteristics by which rocks are judged. Now, since we don't have a lot of rocks that we can verify date back 1,000 years. What we know about the early tradition of rocks and appreciating them and collecting them comes from painting. Now, this is a Song Dynasty copy of a Tang painting that records the arrival of envoys bringing gifts to the Chinese emperor. Now, that's a section of the painting, but we will look at some details. And here, this is probably the envoy himself. You see, he's the most important person. He's on a horse. A servant carries a parasol over his head, not to protect him from the weather, but just to signal that this is the envoy. This is the head of the procession. And he's obviously a foreigner, as you can tell from the heavy beard. But as you look, I don't know if this points it out when I bring it up here, something like that. You see, I don't know exactly what it is, but perhaps a narwhal's tusk. Here's an elephant's tusk that this person is carrying. And here in this cage is probably a rare bird, all of which will be offered at the palace and to the emperor. Now, here in this section, you see oops, went too fast. You see the elephant trunk or tusk again, but you also see rocks. These are not saguaro cactus from Arizona, but they're rocks that are tall and vertical with lots of texturing over the surface with the hollows there. And then there are what seem to be scholars' rocks that are presented in basins, as you see there. And this is a close-up of that. Which reminds us that the use of wooden stands began in the Song Dynasty and really caught on in the Ming Dynasty in the 15th and 16th centuries. Before that, in the Song Dynasty, scholars' rocks were presented in bronze basins. This is just to identify it with the caption. This comes from from the late 16th, early 17th century. When we look at it close up, you see this is an imagined representation of a very famous rock by the Song Dynasty artist and collector Su Shi. The rock is presented in a bronze basin, and it's held in place with small pebbles. And so this is the way they were presented before the wooden stands came into use for rocks, beginning in the Song, but really coming to the fore in the Ming Dynasty. So that's what we have there, a scholar's rock in a basin. Now, some people believe, though there's no way to know for sure, that the pebbles that you see here are the origins of the bumps on the top of the Suzhou type wooden stands, that it's an abstraction of what you see here. It makes good sense. Whether or not it is the case, we don't know and probably never will know for sure. Even in the Ming Dynasty, they sometimes presented a scholar's rock in a basin. This is a ceramic basin like the one that you see here, with some pebbles in it to hold the rock in place. And that particular one has a few acorus grasses growing around the base of the rock. Now, of course, the scholars' rock tradition and the bonsai tradition are closely related, but for the scholars, they really emphasize the rock. And so we don't see little trees or anything like that growing beside it. Now, the rocks indicated status as well as being just a beautiful rock for appreciation. In this 10th century painting, for example, in the Palace Museum in Taipei, there are a group of 8 princes. And of course, they're on some kind of spring excursion, but the grand rock in the background, a beautiful garden rock, is there to attest to their status. In case you don't recognize them as princes, which would be hard to tell just looking at the painting. But when you see the rock, it doesn't tell you that they're princes, but it tells you that these are very important people. So when in a landscape, when you see a garden rock like this, it's definitely indicating the high status. And here's a detailed view of the rock. It's indicating the high status of any people that are in the painting. Now, in this particular painting, it's Zhu Yun breaking the balustrade. Zhu Yun was so angry about something that he approached the emperor. And here we'll look at a detail. Zhu Yun is on the left being restrained. The emperor is seated on the right. And what is behind each figure? A grand garden rock. The one behind the emperor, of course, in a grand marble base for it. So immediately, and this painting goes back to the 12th century, immediately you see that the rocks indicate the importance of the people in the painting, and the rocks confer status on them. Now, these are just children, but it's telling you with that particular rock that these are the children of a noble family playing in the garden of a very elevated household. The lacquered tables would tell you the same thing, but the rock is large, grand, and definitely tells you the same thing. Now, not all rocks have the holes, but they will all have some kind of surface texture. So that you see the rock in the painting is very similar to this particular rock in the slide on the left. Or this painting of Needs On. This is supposed to be a portrait, perhaps imagined, perhaps actual portrait, we don't know, but a portrait of Needs On, done in the second quarter of the 14th century. Now, he was a minimalist, and so he is shown as a scholar. It's not a formal ancestor portrait or anything like that, and he has chosen to surround himself with a few important things. He was a minimalist, if you will, and if for anyone who knows his paintings like this one, you can see that in his paintings. But what does he have with him? To show his cultivation. Not just a painter, but someone who is knowledgeable of the past, collects antiques. You see on the table, there's an ancient bronze vessel, a jaw vessel from the Shang Dynasty, some other things. And then right there's a little rock, not a big grand scholar's rock, but a little mountain of rock that the type that could be used as a brush rest as well. When we look at this painting set in a garden again, it's Scholars at Leisure. It's from a set of 4 showing the different appropriate leisure activities, this one playing the chin or zither, a musical instrument. And what do we have behind the scholar? But this beautiful rock, which once again confers status and says that the person just below the rock is a very important scholar official, even if we don't know exactly who he is. Again, a rock like this would indicate that it's the garden of a person of very high status, a rock of that particular type. It could even be the same rock, since the rock on the left is supposedly coming, dating back to the 17th century, but who knows whether it does or not. Or in a painting like this, another gathering of scholars to look at paintings in the Spring Grass studio. There are rocks on the right, there are rocks on the left. When you look in the studio, you see the scholars surrounding a table, looking at paintings, writing calligraphy and such, with the rocks on the right. And here are the rocks on the left again. So whenever there are going to be scholars, there are going to be rocks indicating cultivated activities, high status, and such. So those are the rocks on the left, again, a rock of this particular type. Now, there are paintings of famous rocks. In most cases, the rocks have disappeared. We don't know exactly what they looked like. But this is a painting that is believed to be by the Emperor Huizong, who was a famous painter, a famous calligrapher, and that's his calligraphy that you see there on the left, as well as a well-known emperor with very refined taste. You'll recall that this particular rock is said to have been intended to be sent to the Emperor Huizong for appreciation in his garden, but that it sank. The boat sank on the way to the capital, and it remained in Shanghai. But that's the rock, one with the interesting shape, the openings or holes, and then of course the intricate surface texture with the hollows, but also the little dimples over the surface of the rock. Now, we don't know this particular rock per se, and there is an image in there, a painting in the exhibition of this particular theme. It's about Mi Fu, who lived in the Northern Song period. He was a government official. He was a great connoisseur of painting and of rocks, and he was also a talented painter and calligrapher. The legend recounts that one day on a walk, he encountered a garden rock more beautiful than any other rock he had ever seen. And so he bowed before the rock and addressed it as elder brother. And so that theme turns up frequently in Chinese and Korean painting as well, as you see here. This interest in and tradition of garden and scholars' rocks was adopted in Korea as well. And so we find some of these same themes in Korean painting. It found its way to Japan as well, although the taste in rocks in Japan differs from those in China and Korea, but still it's another branch of the same tradition. Other famous rocks captured in painting, this one we've seen before. The rock, so far as we know, no longer exists, but there it is. As it's fancifully represented in the late 16th or early 17th century. This rock no longer exists as well, but there was a long scroll. Wu Bin showed 10 different views, the front, the back, the sides, three-quarter view, all kinds of things like that. It's not the same as this rock, and it's certainly not this rock. The one in the painted scroll is a very large rock. This one's quite small. But you can see once again how the appearance of certain rocks, strange as they might seem when we first encounter them, can relate to images in Chinese paintings. Or a painting like this. This particular painting by Rui is not in the exhibition, but there are paintings by Rui in the exhibition, which relate to the theme that we're discussing here. Then there is this famous rock, which once again, the rock itself is lost, but it's a painting of a famous garden rock on its marble pedestal. Oops, even today, this is by Liu Dan, painting a scholar's rock. For whatever reason, he chose to represent it without its stand, but even today, eminent contemporary artists do represent scholars' rocks. Now, this is a very famous scholars' rock that is believed to date to the 17th century. It's known as the Honorable Old Man rock. It's like a sculpture by Giacometti, for example, of a man standing. You see his head at the top, his face in profile. It's as if he is Mi Fu, with his hands raised up and bowing before a rock. Now, the reason I bring it in is because Liu Dan also did, inspired by that painting by Wu Bin of 10 views of a scholar's rock, Liu Dan took inspiration from the painting and did 10 different views of this Honorable Old Man rock here. The rock itself is now in a private collection. It was in the States, in the United States, now is in a private collection in Beijing. But there are the paintings, and there you see how faithful Liu Dan's painting of the rock is to the rock itself. Now, types of rocks, and this will be the last part of the lecture. Like I said, most of the garden rocks are Taihu stones. That means they come from Lake Tai. Now, looking at the map, Beijing is up where you see it there. Lake Tai is just below the arrow, right at the tip of the arrow. That is the arrow, that is the area of China that was the homeland of scholars, if you will, certainly by the Ming period. The Suzhou and the Great Gardens are there and such. Now, the rocks were retrieved, the great Taihu stones were retrieved from the lake. It's recorded that already by the Tang Dynasty, that is to say 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, when they loved the stones from Lake Tai already by that early period for placement in the garden. Texts tell us that already by the late Tang period, the supply of natural rocks in Lake Tai had been exhausted. So they found other limestone rocks, which they would put in the lake, and the action of the water moving, carrying the sand with it, chemicals in the water and such, would cause the holes to form and create the distinctive shape that we think of as Taihu stones. Now, the rocks were not meant to be put in the lake and leave them there for a year or something like that. No, the stories tell us that grandfather would put the group of rocks in the lake. They would be watched over by the son and perhaps harvested by the grandson. So this production of rocks, when the natural ones were gone, but you still need more of the same type, was something that was done over time. And so I suppose each generation would put a new group of rocks into Lake Tai to be naturally sculpted into what we think of as garden and and scholars rocks today. So this is a garden rock from Lake Tai. When we ask, people always want to ask, are these completely 100% fashioned by nature? Well, of course, we can't answer that. How do you know if something has been touched up 100 years ago or with another hole added here or something like that? The ideal is that each rock, whether garden rock or scholar's rock, was completely shaped by nature. But of course, in most cases, there's probably some, what should we say, human enhancement. In the worst case, it's completely sculpted, which isn't wanted, but that is the case in some instances. But the ideal is that the rock would be completely shaped by nature. So that's an example of a garden rock, Taihu. This is an example of the Taihu stone as a scholar's rock. And you see, it's the weathering when the Taihu rocks are outdoors. The rain, maybe sleet, if in the north, in the north, snow and freezing weather that cause the surface to turn gray. But the scholar's rocks from Taihu are basically sort of an off-white ivory color, as you see here. But the Taihu rocks typically have a lot of perforations, a lot of dimples, a lot of hollows, as you see in that rock, or as you see in this one. Now, when we look at Ling Bi, and that's a name that I've mentioned a number of times, that produces the black stones. Those are the most preferred stones of all, whether for garden rocks or scholars rocks. We don't see many Ling Bi garden rocks simply because Ling Bi stones are, compared to other types of stone, are relatively rare, and they tend to be relatively small. And therefore, it's difficult to position them in a garden so that they really command the attention they deserve. So Ling Bi stones are usually, and that's a great example of a Ling Bi stone. I keep showing it over and over. The Ling Bi stones are usually reserved for scholars' rocks. Now, these come from caves in and around Ling Bi, which is the place name. It's in northeastern Anhui province, as you see there. The stones themselves, again, people did not go collect rocks on their own. One hoped that the Ling Bi rock that you buy has a long history of ownership and a very distinguished pedigree. But of course, at some point, new rocks are harvested, prepared for the market and introduced to the market. So at some point, each rock was newly appearing on the market. But one's hope, of course, is that you are buying an old rock with an old stand. Now, the characteristics of the Ling Bi, the stone is basically black, or it may be a very deep charcoal gray that's been polished and perhaps a little wax added to the surface, which gives the luster that you see here, making it look very dark black or dark gray. The surface will be relatively smooth. Of course, there will be little wrinkles, there will be indentations and such. There will be holes and openings, but compared to some other stones, relatively smooth, as you see here. And of course, these two are both on northern style stands, if you're paying attention to that, looking like little tables. This one in the exhibition is Ling Bi. It's also on a northern style stand. And sometimes these are all limestone, first of all, to characterize them. The Taihu stones, the Ling Bi stones, the Ying stones, they're all varieties of limestone. Now, the Ling Bi stones and Ying stones often have, as you see here at the top of the stone, veins of calcite, which is also limestone, but these are built up over the centuries, over the millennia, if you will, build up one deposit on top of another, on top of another. They're sedimentary stones. And so there were times when the layer being formed would be of white calcite or white limestone, as opposed to the dark limestone that we see here. And of course, the veins formed horizontally, so that when you see a horizontal vein of calcite, as you do here, you know that this is the way it was oriented in the cave from which it was harvested. Not that that's important, but it's just an interesting feature. This is also Ling Bi stone, very black, relatively smooth surface, relatively glossy, as you see there. When you look, this is a close-up of a Lingby stone. It's from the area right here, that area, the peak on the right. You see it up close there. You see it's relatively smooth, some little wrinkles here and there, a vein of calcite running, of white calcite running through right there, another deposit of calcite up there, but overall a black stone. The other type of most preferred dark rock for scholars' rocks is called Ying stone. It comes from Yingda, hence the name Ying stone, which is down in the south, near Canton. Hong Kong is down here, Canton is there, and Yingda is some miles to the north of Guangzhou, or in English, Canton. This is an example of a Ying stone. They can have lots of openings, lots of holes, or relatively few, same as the Lingby stones, but the surface is much more highly textured, as you see here in this particular rock. It also has veins of calcite running through it, as you see there. This is very typical. The preference is for solid black, but at the same time, it's accepted that these veins of white calcite are a naturally occurring phenomenon, and therefore no one holds a grudge against them, so to speak, unless they sort of dominate the rock, rather than allowing the black or dark gray to show through. But there you really see how the surface of the Ying stone is almost always in motion, if you will. Or here's another example of Ying stone of the surface, where you see it's one little dimple after another, after another, after another. And so that's a very good example of a Ying stone. Another example of a Ying stone, put it side by side with the Lingby. And these are just in case you want to know the ins and outs of collecting rocks. How do you tell them apart? Lingby, the best ones are black, relatively smooth, as you see on the right. Ying tend to be dark gray, not black, but dark gray, and tend to have a very active surface, a highly textured surface with lots of little dimples, as you see there. The Old Man Rock, which Liaodong depicted in that set of 10 paintings of the Old Man Rock, certainly is Ying stone, as is this one. I think when you look at this, now suddenly you realize, yes, it's a Ying stone. Look at the texturing, the dimpling of the surface. Now, the last major type of sort of dark stone are Chilean, and I'll show you just a couple of examples. They're sort of the third most favored after Lingby and Ying stones. Chilean is a place name, and so when we say a Chilean stone, it means it's a stone that came from or near Chilean. It's a mountainous region, and these stones don't come from caves like Ying and Lingby. These stones were harvested on mountainsides and things like that. Their character, the color will be dark, it'll be gray, but in many cases there will be some rust brown or caramel yellow incorporated into the stone, and again, they're limestone, and so this one does have that vein of calcite running through it. These are characterized by layer after layer after layer. As you see here, Chinese refer to them as wrinkles, but that's the color, and this wrinkled effect or layered effect that you see there is the way one recognizes Chilean stone. This is also Chilean. It's less evident here, the layering, but when you look in this area of the stone right there, you can see that layered effect. Now, these stones, like I say, even today, Chinese collectors in particular want the stone to come from a reliable, distinguished antique dealer, and for the stone to have provenance. And the very best stones can sell for very, very high prices. These are not something, the best ones that you find at the local antique store. This one sold 6 or 7 years ago in Hong Kong for over $1 million US. So sometimes even the very small rocks, if they're the best of show, if you will, can sell for very high prices. The Old Man Rock, which we saw, that one right there that you've seen, that one would certainly go for well over $1 million were it to come on the market today. So these are not trivial little rocks that one stumbles upon along the beach. those turn up too, masquerading as old scholars' rocks. But the very best scholars' rocks have the tradition that we were just talking about. Then the other types of rocks that make their appearance in the 18th, 19th century and are prized even today are the more colorful ones, like the hornblende stone, malachite, which can be unpolished, as we see here. When we see malachite, we're usually thinking of polished malachite, as you see there. But this is the malachite before the surface is removed. We see unpolished malachite in scholars' rocks, as we do in this particular example, but we seldom see unpolished malachite outside of this particular circumstance. So at first it looks a little unfamiliar, but there it is as an unpolished malachite stone serving as a scholar's rock and recalling a densely forested mountain. This is a forested mountain of a different type, but a polished malachite rock, the azurite rock that we have seen before. And this is the last slide that we will look at. Today, there is an interest in producing scholars' rocks, if you will, in media other than stone. So these, of course, are newly made. This is a famous contemporary artist, Don Wang, who has crafted this particular rock, which is a copy of an existing scholar's rock in stainless steel, but still has a wooden stand. There is an artist, a potter, here in the Boston area, who makes porcelain replicas, if you will, of scholars' rocks. And so in the contemporary world, there's a great deal of experimentation, a love of the rocks, but wanting to present them in new material, new formats, and such. So that brings us to the end of the lecture. And I would just say, you now realize that this is a very old tradition, that there are garden rocks as well as scholars' rocks, closely related traditions, and they are related to the bonsai tradition. But two distinct branches of the same general tradition, that it's a very old tradition and that it's still a living tradition, people collecting rocks, but also artists making new rocks in materials like stainless steel and porcelain that collectors of a generation ago probably couldn't have imagined. Thank you very much for joining the program. And if you have questions, I'll try my best to answer a few.
Thank you so much. If everyone could just join me on Zoom, it's there. The applause falls a little flat, but thank you so very much for sharing thousands of years of history with us in just under an hour. That's no small feat. So thank you very much. We do have time for some questions, and there are a few different formats you can use to submit your questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat box. There is a Q&A box if you find yourself that way. I can manage that as well. Or feel free to unmute yourself and raise your hand. All of these are welcome. We do have one question for you already, Bob. Could you please compare Chinese and Japanese rocks?
Sure. Now, Chinese and to some extent Korean rocks, although we didn't look at any Korean rocks, we saw one Korean painting at least. You know the characteristics. The scholars' rocks love the textured surface, love the perforations and such. Often, as we see here in this stainless steel example, have a small base that fits into a receptacle at the top of the wooden stand. Now, Japanese rocks, I don't have any examples to show you here. Japanese rocks tend to be more solid, and they often take inspiration, as you might expect, from mountains. But what is the quintessential Japanese mountain? Mount Fuji, of course. And so many Japanese rocks will have a triangular form, imitating the form of Mount Fuji. And of course, the Japanese are interested in different types of stone, not just the Lingbi, Ying, and other stones from China, using Japanese stones from Japan rather than stones from China. and they have different interests in the appearance of the surface. The Chinese like the highly textured surfaces, which we saw in the Ying stone, for example, with all that dimpling over the surface. It's hard to characterize without slides, but Japanese have a taste for a different kind of surface. Another thing, as I mentioned, close your eyes. Oh, well, it's farther back. I'll find it there. Talking about the wooden stands. Here, I mentioned with the Chinese rocks, because they want to preserve the natural form of the rock. Like I said, they want to say that nature created the rock in its entirety with no human enhancement, which means that in order to fit on this type of stand, if something has to be modified, they will modify the stand to accommodate the rock. In many cases, the Japanese prefer to modify the bottom of the rock to make it absolutely flat, to fit on the flat top of a wooden stand. So those are some very basic differences. Japanese also are quite fond of collectors going into nature and finding rocks on their own that will be suitable. Not all of them. Some of them buy them at antique galleries as well, but somewhat different. A Chinese scholar would not that he couldn't or might not have the interest, but he thinks it appropriate that one acquires a rock with an old pedigree from an antiques gallery, so that the rock is one type of antique alongside an ancient bronze, alongside an ancient jade. They are all collected antiques. Whereas in Japan, some collectors may be that way. Other collectors are happy to go out and look for rocks in nature on their own, and then modify the rock suitably so that it sits properly on a stand. Also, in talking about collecting in Japan, one might note that there are those who collect in Japanese taste, where the rocks might be the shape of Mount Fuji, but there are those who want to collect Chinese style rocks. And the rocks that they collect are sometimes very similar to the ones that the Chinese collect, but sometimes there is a distinct taste in Japanese collecting of Chinese rocks. So that's without a whole lecture, we can't really go into it, but that's perhaps a hint of some of the differences.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? You can either put them in the chat box, or if anyone would like to unmute, this would be a good time.
I can go to the chat box. Let's see, I just opened the chat box.
Yes. And there is one more question in there asking about, do the tastes in Chinese stones change over time?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do the tastes? Oh, no, then we're on the same page. Yeah, just do the tastes. Yeah, the last question in there.
Okay, this is about, can you access the recording? That's for you to answer.
Yeah, don't worry.
Can you compare Chinese and Japanese? We just did. To Tom's question, okay, you answering a question. Do the taste in Chinese stones change over time? Yes, of course. The first taste was, I mean, we can't go into all of that. It's complex and probably too detailed for a general 1 hour lecture. But yes, initially, in the beginning of the scholars rock tradition, the scholars only wanted Ling B rocks. So one change is the expansion of the canon to include Ying stones, for example. The reason given, we don't know that it's true, but the reason that's always advanced is that the cave from which they had been harvesting Ling B stones, the stones had been exhausted. And since there was a demand for these kinds of stones, and they didn't have any more Ling B rocks, they found the Ying stones, which were similar, although not identical. And then, of course, they discovered another cave later where they could harvest more Ling B stones. But once the Ying stones had been introduced to the canon, if you will. They continued to be prized, but the Lingby always had priority over anything else. Other changes, the earliest of the rocks in the Song Dynasty. Oh, that's going there. I don't know. I get back. Where was that? Okay, down here. Close your eyes. This rock is believed, there's no way to know for sure. I've labeled it Qing Dynasty here, but there are many believe this particular rock dates to the Song Dynasty. There's no way to know with these rocks. If you want to test them geologically or anything like that, you're going to get the date of the rock, which will be millions of years old. There's no way to a scientific test which would determine when it was identified as a work of art and was collected as such. There are those who believe that this rock might actually date to the Song Dynasty, and that it embodies the characteristics, the stylistic and aesthetic characteristics that were first prized. That is to say that it looks like two substantial mountains with a valley between them. That the taste for the more elaborate rocks evolved just a little bit later. Only thing I can say is that there was already a taste for garden rocks with lots of holes and then the standard type of rock. Whether or not this is true, but yes, there must have been a taste that evolved over time. The problem is there are very few paintings that include scholars' rocks. Lots of paintings include garden rocks, but very few paintings include scholars' rocks. And even if this rock now, this black one, Lingby, dates to the Song Dynasty, there's no way to know for sure or to prove, let alone to prove, that it dates to the Song Dynasty. So when we give a date for a rock, that is when it was first collected and appreciated as a rock, it's not so much that that's definitely the date the rock was first appreciated. It's the date that we think the characteristics embodied in the rock were first appreciated. So if this doesn't date to the Song Dynasty, to the best of our understanding, it incorporates the aesthetic and stylistic features that we think were prized during the Song Dynasty. So if that's the case, they move from simpler, more blocky, like this type, to more complex, like this type, looking more like a scholar's rock. Like I say, no way to know for sure, but yes, there was an evolution, even if we can't pinpoint every step in that evolution. Now, are there more in the box? Let's see.
We do. We have two more in the box. One question asking, are there any spiritual mythology attributed to the rocks? For instance, we say bowing to the rocks.
On the part of scholars, for the most part, no. He was bowing to the rock not because it was a deity or anything like that. He was bowing to it as a great work of art, just acknowledging that it was, he supposedly said, it's the most beautiful garden rock I have ever seen, and therefore I'm going to bow before it and call it elder brother. But it wasn't a spiritual kind of thing. Of course, writers attribute all kinds of spiritual things to these. In 1,000 years, people may attribute all kinds of spiritual things to Mark Rothko paintings, to Jackson Pollock paintings, to Henry Moore sculpture, to Giacometti sculpture, Brancusi sculptures. Who knows in 1,000 years what people will say. But people always want meaning. And when there is no meaning, they will create a meaning. That is, I mean, modern writers and such. So yes, many people attribute mystical things, spiritual things. For the most part, they were simply appreciating them as representing mountains or appreciating the beautiful form, as we would appreciate the beautiful form in the West of a Henry Moore sculpture or a Jackson Pollock painting. There might have been others who saw spiritual meaning in them, but when we look, and the reason I say this with some confidence is when we read ancient texts from the Ming Dynasty, from the Qing Dynasty, about the rocks, they never mention anything about that. Like the one quote that I put up, there's a comparison with painting. If the rock doesn't resemble a painting, don't pick that rock. It should resemble a painting and its general characteristics. There is no mention of spiritual qualities and things like that. That's why when we read about them, I may be too cynical, but I just write it off as a fanciful musing of some modern author. Are there other questions?
Yes, we have one more in the chat. Can you date a rock by the stand?
No. You might be able to date a stand, but who knows if the stand isn't a replacement? That is, you might have an old rock that the original stand got broken, and so a new stand was made for it. The azurite, let me put that down. Can I get back here? Yes. Oh, going the wrong way. Now what happened? Close your eyes. This rock has a new stand. It had an older stand. The stand was damaged, a new stand was made. So this is not to say it's 1,000 years old. The rock probably dates to the 19th century, early 20th century, something like that. It had an older stand, the stand was damaged, a new stand was made. So you can have an old rock. You can have a rock that's 1,000 years old that's had many different stands associated with it over the centuries. In like manner, you can have a stand that is an old stand. The rock that's associated with isn't particularly distinguished, and some unscrupulous person takes the old stand, discards the, well, not discards, but takes the older rock, has a new stand for it, and being unscrupulous, takes the old stand and associates it with a brand new rock and says, look at the stand. Because of this old stand, the rock itself dates to the 17th century. So no, they're two different things. They were made, they're associated today, but you never have any assurance unless it's a brand new rock that the stand is made at the same time as the rock itself. So we can date the style of stands, which is like dating the style of the rock. It doesn't mean that's exactly when the rock was produced. This stand is a modern stand, a 21st century stand. This kind of stand probably dates to the 19th century, something like that. So it's the style, so it's a 19th century style. Whether the rock was created in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, difficult to know. This is a stand that we associate with the Ming Dynasty, the style. Now, whether the stand dates to the Ming Dynasty, some people think this rock dates to the Ming Dynasty. I personally think the rock might date to the 17th century, as I put here, but we can't know that for sure. Now, if the rock dates to the 17th century, if the stand has been with the rock since the beginning, maybe the stand dates to the 17th century as well. So it's a Ming style stand. It's a late 16th to 17th century style stand. But whether it dates to that period or is a 19th century stand in 17th century style, there's just no way to know. So we try. We like to think, they go together. They both date to the 17th century. And as a professor, I would say, wake up, think about it. They're not integral. There's a rock, there's a stand. Treat them separately, but be happy they're together. More questions?
I have a question, if I may jump in.
Of course.
So as I began curating this exhibition, a lot of people jumped out of the woodwork and told me that they collected rocks and, things that they picked up in the beach, things that they'd actually stolen from other people's garden beds even. Collecting rocks, appreciating rocks seems to be, it was very widespread. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about the allure of rocks, like why, and I feel like the rock is like one of the, everyone has picked up an interesting rock and put it in their pocket. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, why we're so attracted to rocks.
It's a very good question. Alas, I don't have an answer. But there are rock collecting societies in this country, a well-known one in California on the West Coast, particularly in the Southern California, Los Angeles, that particular area. But there are ones on the East Coast as well. There's a fascination with them. How far back the interest in American collecting of rock dates, I don't know. Part of it has been sparked by the interest in Chinese scholars' rocks, the Japanese collecting of rocks. That is to say, and I can't put my finger on when Americans began to collect rocks as treasured objects as opposed to something found on the beach, along with the seashell, that kind of thing. I don't know. I dare say it probably didn't begin before World War II, or if it did begin a little before World War II, as some Americans were traveling to Japan and some were traveling to China. I dare say it didn't begin before the 20th century. The reason I'm a little bit cautious there, my first exposure to any kind of collected rock was through my teacher, Lawrence Sickman, who many of you know was the senior American historian of Chinese art in the middle of the 20th century. He was the director of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and he built one of the finest collections of Chinese art in the United States, along with other museums too, but still, with paintings, ceramics, bronzes, Buddhist sculpture, and such. Now, he didn't collect rocks for the museum. It was before the advent of museums thinking rocks were an appropriate thing to collect, which would come in the second half of the 20th century. But Mr. Sickman had lived in China for around 6 years, from 1928 to 1934. He had done graduate work at Harvard, studying with Langdon Warner, studying Chinese art, and then he went to China to study Chinese art at its source. And he became interested not so much in Ling Bi and things like that, which he didn't really know about at that time, but he became very interested in Taihu stones, and he didn't collect them there. But living in Kansas City, he found a place in Missouri near the Ozarks where there were stones that were very, very similar to Taihu stones. And he collected a number of them, which he put in the garden of his own home. And so going to his house and seeing the rocks there, of course, I'd seen them in painting, but at that time, as a graduate student, I didn't quite yet make the connection between the rocks that I was seeing in paintings and the actual rocks that he had in his garden. And so he was telling me the story of discovering the Taihu stones when he was, for his personal discovery, not major scholarly discovery, but discovering the rocks and appreciating their beauty and wanting to have some. And when he got back, he found a source for some of them, and he collected them. So that's when I began paying attention to rocks. This would have been in the early 1970s, 50 years ago, of not really studying them, but being awakened that people collect these. But I would dare say that Mr. Sickman collecting that kind of, or a desire awakening in him to be able to collect some rocks like that. In the late 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, he certainly must have been one of the first Americans to be interested in collecting that kind of thing. So I think the current phenomenon in the West of people being interested in collecting them, whether they want to collect scholars' rocks or whether they simply want to walk and on their own find rocks, in the West is a 20th century phenomenon with ever increasing frequency as one progresses through the century and into the 21st century. Why people are interested in them, I don't know. As we've seen, they can be very beautiful. They're not just rocks, they are a form of abstract sculpture. They may resemble a mountain, but many of them don't resemble mountains. It's just like a Henry Moore sculpture, the one I showed with the two curving forms. Are they really representing human beings? Well, maybe, but in a very contorted position. Better just to appreciate it as two beautiful abstract forms that are interacting. The same thing with the Scholar's Rocks. You can appreciate it as a mountain, but ultimately it's just appreciate it for the beautiful forms, textures, colors, and energy that it offers. I wonder if you, Rhiannon, have thoughts about why people like to collect rocks, now that you've worked with them as well and have talked to many collectors.
Well, I agree with you about appreciating them as abstract objects. Like I sometimes find that this is meant to be in the form of a dragon or whatever. It sort of feels reductive and limiting. I mean, that's not why it appeals to you, because if you like dragons, you can look at a beautifully realistic painting of this mythical beast that doesn't actually exist, and that will give you more of a sense of what a dragon might look like, perhaps, if they actually did exist. But yes, I believe it's more the abstract values of the form, the surface texture, this sort of sense of tension, especially in Lingby rocks. I think that is certainly what appeals to me. But I do, I have rocks in my house that I have picked up in places, and they are among some of my most precious things in my possession, because they are attached to memories. But there's a wonderful quote, and it did include it, I think, in our little exhibition pamphlet, and I'm going to completely bungle it, but about the forces of the universe being contained in a rock. And I think there's something, we think about diamonds as being, embodying all this compressed carbon. It's a lump of coal that's been compressed over millions of years, and a rock is similar to that. I mean, it's been laid down by sedimentation, it's been spewed out of a volcano, it's been compressed under layers of sediment. But I think that's, that it's this static, cold thing, and yet it's full of energy. So I think that's part of the appeal, perhaps, of rocks. If anyone else has thoughts.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, in terms of collecting, people like to collect things, and collecting Scholar's Rocks that you buy is one thing. Another thing, if you find them on your own, if you find something beautiful, it's quite wonderful. You can, if you find it on your own, you found a beautiful object, a beautiful shell, that kind of thing. And if you find it on the beach, or find it climbing a mountain, or just on a morning walk, it's something you don't have to pay for. You can have something very beautiful. You can own it. You can take it home. You can see it and appreciate it every day. If you could find ceramics, beautiful ceramics, on your walk along the beach, people would collect those there. But alas, the things that turn up on the beach, with rare exception, are stones, seashells, and such. The same thing when you walk in the mountains or walk other places, you're going to find stones. And like you say, I think people do like the connection with nature, to have something that's a part of nature, and that nature created and is also very beautiful. Maybe as simple as that. I see there is something in the chat box.
Yes, Michael has added in the chat box another aspect of collecting rocks, collecting pieces of the earth, and how they've been used through history.
Of course, and the Chinese have a tradition of collecting jade, fine jade, that goes back to the Neolithic period. So the jade tradition is completely separate from the Scholar's Rock tradition, but it's just to say that already in Neolithic times, the Chinese were very interested in the finest of all, in some ways, the finest of all stones from the Chinese point of view, much more revered than diamonds or emeralds or sapphires, rubies, anything else. The Chinese prized jade above all other stones. They had found it, discovered deposits of it, and learned how to work it already in Neolithic times. And in slightly later times, they would import the stone from Khotan, the finest jade worked in the Song Yuan Ming periods, Qing period as well, was actually being imported from Khotan. That's how interested they were in the stone. So yes, there's a very, very long tradition of appreciating fine stones, whether gemstones or just fine stones. Something else in the Q&A box.
Yes, and I think that may have to be our final question, just to be mindful of everyone's time. The final question, how did collecting rocks contribute to the cultivation, so to speak, of the Chinese scholar?
How it could, well, probably it's difficult to answer that, but probably with the association both of the paintings and the rocks with the Taoist tradition. If one was to understand any kind of reason for having the rock other than just aesthetic appreciation, it would signal that one knows something about Taoism, that one is a scholar having studied that. It's putting alongside the antiques. Keep in mind that the Chinese paintings that we see in museums today would not have been understood by the vast majority of the Chinese public at any period in Chinese history. Those paintings were made by scholars. They were appreciated by scholars, wealthy collectors, the imperial family within the palace and things like that. The very fact that you would have a painting by a distinguished artist in your home and that you would appreciate it speaks to your level of cultivation, because the Chinese paintings, particularly like the painting I showed Nizan, I showed the portrait of Nizan and his minimalist painting with him. Those kinds of paintings are not just paintings. The goal was a marriage of poetry, painting, and calligraphy. In the West, we think of the three sister arts, if you will, as architecture, sculpture, and painting. The three sister arts, or the three fine arts in China, are considered to be poetry, painting, and calligraphy. That is the arts of the brush. So that someone like Nizan, you want to do the painting yourself, you want to have composed the poem, a very elegant literary poem with historical allusions within the poem. You want to have composed it yourself, and then you want to have written the poem in fine calligraphy on your painting. Taking it even a step further, some of the artists who were good calligraphers and really wanted everything you see on the surface of the painting to be their own work would carve their own seals. This brought about a new type of stone being introduced into the seal carving tradition. Before the Yuan Ming period, most seals were done in metal. They were cast bronze, cast silver, cast gold, something like that, or they were done in jade. But when artists began to want to carve their own seals, they were not bronze casters. They couldn't do that. Jade is too difficult for anyone but an experienced lapidary artist to work with. They found various kinds of soapstone, tianhuang, tianbai, jishui, and other kinds of stones that are soft, and they could carve their seals. So that the desire was to do the painting, compose the poetry, write the poetry in elegant calligraphy, and if possible, stamp seals that you yourself have carved on the painting. So the painting shows a great level of cultivation right there, that you're a master of all of those arts. But in addition, the painting itself should incorporate references and allusions to earlier painting styles, just as any inscription on the painting, poetry and such, should have references to earlier works, literary works, historical works, and things like that. So the paintings themselves become very art historical, very inbred, if you will, by the time you got to the 19th century. Now, because the scholars' rocks are part of that same tradition, it shows your cultivation, being able to adapt your eye from understanding painting to sufficiently understanding painting that you can choose the proper rock, of knowing about Lingbi. And so the cultivation of the Chinese scholar, it's not just a scholar studying literature. Chinese scholar was supposed to be a Chinese scholar of old, like in the West, the so-called Renaissance man, where you were a master of history. poetry, not just composing poetry, but you had a knowledge of poetry going back hundreds of years. You had a knowledge of painting and calligraphy, not just being able to do it, but you knew the history of Chinese painting. You knew the history of Chinese calligraphy. Oh, you want me to write in the manner of that particular ancient calligrapher. You not only had to be able to do it, but you knew what that calligrapher's style was. You want me to paint in the style of this Song Dynasty artist, when in fact I'm living in the 17th century. Sure, I know that artist's work. I can paint in that artist's style. And so this cultivation of a Chinese scholar encompassed history, philosophy, literature, painting, calligraphy, all kinds of things. And part of the breadth of knowledge that the scholar was expected to know and understand was, by the time you got to Ming and Qing times, fine scholars' rocks as well. So in that sense, learning about rocks contributed to the overall cultivation of the scholar and the scholar's very elevated knowledge.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I think
thanks
we
to
are
all of
right.
you. It's been a treat to be with all of you. I'm glad you were interested in this topic, and thanks for joining the program today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Yes.
much.
And renewed congratulations to Rhiannon for the exhibition. What a wonderful thing.
It's been great fun doing this. One of my favorite projects so far. So
Very good.
thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right, take care, everyone. If you have not yet seen Mountains of the Mind, the exhibition at the Ringling, it is on view until June 23rd. We hope to see you here and also to share your stories about why you also love rocks. Thank you all very much, Dr. Mowry. It was a true honor and pleasure. I will end the Zoom now for everyone. So I hope you all have a very wonderful Tuesday afternoon.